Okay, today let's start with something new, and so we are right now at still in the language and markup section. We're going to jump into JavaScript today. So JavaScript is an enormously huge topic. It has become more and more important. So it started out as like a little bit of a playful approach on what you can do on the front end, but it has grown to so much more. So let me just jump to the right slide here. There we go. So what is basically the stuff that we want to talk about in this first JavaScript video? So first of all, let's basically see, because if you start Googling around and like you find your topics and you're searching for things on on Reddit, Stack Overflow, whatever it might be, you will encounter a couple of terms. So I want you to help to put that into context. So the first thing that you're gonna basically see is ECMA, and that is something that basically has a lot to do with standardization of JavaScript. So back in the days, a little bit of history here. Back in the days, the implementation of JavaScript in browsers was different, just like it was the case in CSS. So there are a couple of differences of how certain things are implemented and how certain browsers react to particular things methods and of the language and so on. That's to this day a problem with, well, you guessed it, Internet Explorer, which is still around, even though even Microsoft has finally declared it dead. But ECMA itself is basically the agreed upon language structure of JavaScript, and whenever you see, like, according to ECMA, then what it basically means is like that is the current state of the JavaScript standard. What you will find out, though, is that in the, well, let's call it the colloquial use, what it refers to is often more of a differentiation between, okay, how modern is your JavaScript, right? Because and we will see that in code. So when people refer to ECMAscript, what they normally mean is that particular syntactic sugar is used of modern JavaScript versions, and the reason why that is used, because it is easier to say ECMAscript than to say, like, well, as stuff you can use since ECMA 2016 and or whatever. So that is basically the background in that. And if you start learning today, then naturally using modern ECMAscript syntax is absolutely okay. The reason why you still learn older versions is to be able to maintain legacy code and to know what's going on. But if you basically start working today, what you will find in anything basically dubbed ECMA is what you want to go for. Now, the next thing that you will hear a lot is vanilla. Now, vanilla is an expression that many languages use, and it is referred to as the absence of any kind of library or framework. What does that mean? So nowadays you have a lot of people that develop in a particular framework, and they have become, or they grew into such massive constructs that sometimes they're pretty far away from the actual language JavaScript, right? So when people say vanilla JavaScript, what they mean is like an actual JavaScript, so not in Angular or not in React or whatever, like in the base language, so without any kind of library or well, I mean, not necessarily library, but without any kind of framework that would basically influence how functionality is written or can be written. Then the next point that we're going to go about is library. So a library, back in the days, that's also like a little bit of historical reasons, is something that would basically facilitate particular helpers to ease your work with JavaScript And the difference between a framework and a library is in JavaScript due to you know how how the language itself is structured. It's pretty hard to make. So if it were up to me, for example, I would place jQuery as a library. As you can see, I put it in below framework because that is normally how it is referred to, and it has some elements of a framework. But if you compare it to different kinds of languages, then you will notice that it's actually pretty hard to distinguish between a framework and a library when it comes to JavaScript. And if you look at things like jQuery, you will kind of know why. So there are kind of elements that enable you to facilitate particular things a framework would have. Yet on the other hand, there's really not that. There's no opinionated structure of code that you have to follow in order to make it work. So it's actually more like a library. So that said, the next thing that you will probably be hearing from are frameworks, and frameworks are dominating the world of JavaScript. So what I listed here are just the most popular ones. So jQuery is something that I mean, to be super honest, I don't know why it's still that popular. It was mind-opening back in the days because it simplified and most importantly standardized what what used to be a problem. And a lot of what jQuery does, you would now find within the native language itself. So within ECMAscript. Nonetheless, it's still around. It's still taught, and it's still pretty dominant on a lot of even new projects, which again I don't really understand because you really don't need it anymore at all. And it doesn't provide, the kind of power that the other modern frameworks like Angular, React, or Vue would have. With Angular, you got to be a little bit careful. It's a very difficult choice of a word. So AngularJS was not only a different version of Angular, but a different framework. So ever since Angular 2 started, the whole concept of how to work with Angular completely changed. And so just at this point, you just got to be aware there's a difference between Angular and AngularJS. And unfortunately, you would see the wrong expression used throughout the internet. So sometimes, people say AngularJS, and then when you look at their code, what they mean is Angular, and vice versa. So it's a little bit of a problem, and I wish they would have chosen a different name for Angular 2+, which basically is the Angular version starting from 2, and now I think we're at 8 or so. So that's something you got to basically look out for. React is at the moment the most dominant framework, also probably, by far probably very popular at the moment. Don't really understand why. I think that a lot of, or the reason for that is that the way it implements reusability. So when we talk about, you can simply use React components without really understanding what you're doing. So it's very approachable from that perspective. However, it has a couple of design challenges if you write React that are unnecessarily complex in particular regards, and I don't want to go too much into it because on the other hand, exactly those design decisions make it so powerful. But again, this would be a very complex topic that for people that talk about React hooks and so on. It doesn't make sense to go into that without having a deeper understanding of how to work with JavaScript in the realm of a front-end application, or even with React Native. I mean, yeah. Again, it's a complex topic. There are Unfortunately, what the popularity has led to React being the first framework that people jump into, and I would actually not recommend that. Not because it isn't a great framework, but has a level of complexity that is confusing to the beginner and probably kind of slows down progress overall. It's easier to jump in after you're pretty secure with either vanilla JavaScript or an easier framework to approach. Now, Vue is now, I don't know if it's officially out, but it's going to be in version 3. It is a very interesting framework. I personally like it the most at the moment. The reason is because it is kind of like this perfect in-between of it being extremely powerful, yet very, very easy to approach and easy to teach and learn. And it has a lot of it has all the features that you want from it, from a development perspective. And the way you can build is pretty open to like you can go really deep into using precompilers and .vue as a file extension, and I mean there's so much to be said about that. But you can also write pretty straightforward JavaScript and run this whole thing client side, and basically don't have to have any kind of deployment logic whatsoever. So you can basically use it and gradually grow into more complex building procedures. So that's why I would recommend Vue as basically the first framework if you're there. Now, jumping over to concepts, the next thing that happened in JavaScript is something that was basically the change of, or the beginning of the Node era, right? So about 10 years ago, all of a sudden, somebody took the V8 engine and placed it into an environment that we now call Node. What does this environment do? Well, it's basically a JavaScript it is JavaScript that runs on a server, and therefore all of a sudden you can write JavaScript in the back end. And so what has happened recently is that people learn JavaScript in a full stack approach as the first backend language, because it is assumed that, hey, you only have to learn one language and you can write that in the front end and the back end. And I have a lot of students, and believe me, this promise just falls through completely, because it is quite easy to separate things by concept. So if you for example, learn HTML and CSS, you really can't mix that up. So even if you write inline CSS rules or style attributes in your HTML, it will still be quite straightforward, understood that that's something else. You're not writing HTML when you're writing CSS. Now, when you start learning JavaScript, and especially if you have hybrid applications like your Express app that basically renders static files, but yet you still build an API and so on, it is very confusing for people to basically distinguish what happens when and where. And additionally, JavaScript is per design asynchronous, so it's hard for the beginner to wrap the head around how basically code is interpreted at which point in time and what happens on particular actions and events and so on. So that is something that is nowadays simply one of the hurdles that we basically face, right? That does not mean though that Node isn't a great environment. It is. It's actually pretty useful for a lot of things. We will look at that a little bit more into our local development. So that would be the next point, right? Is the local building and pre-processing. So Node enables you to do a lot of things, and you normally don't even notice that so much. But you will see whatever course you take that something like npm is used, which is at the end just a Node module that executes a download and then places files accordingly in your project, and that same for deployment and so on. So it's pretty pretty useful for a lot of things. And we're going to look at it probably only from that perspective. So from basically running Node locally, so not as a deployed system, but as a local system that we use for development. And well, that would basically also include packages. So packages are basically the concept of taking libraries and having them available at your disposal in an online repository. So if you use particular things over and over again, it really makes sense to simply say, like, okay, instead of having that bound to a particular project, it is abstracted pretty high, and you basically use those packages. And at the beginning, you will not write those packages anyway. You will use existing packages from the open source world in order to help you code and use libraries and frameworks out of the box. So that's basically on the high level what we're gonna do, and we are going to more or less remember a lot of concepts that we jumped in from PHP. If you have not seen that, maybe jump to the video on the playlist with PHP, because a lot of things like okay, how to declare variables and so on, and what's a loop, is basically going to be applicable for this course as well. I will somewhat explain what we're doing at any given point in time. But if you want to have some more in-depth, I would recommend watching the complete playlist anyway, in order to get you started. Okay, so why don't we jump into some code? So what we have is basically, so what you see, I set up in HTML, and that is pretty boring. So the only thing that I'm having here is my topic for today. That's the H1 JavaScript. And what I want to do is basically I want to create a file, and it's going to be a JavaScript file, and I'm simply going to call this script. Okay. So script.js is intended now to run in the browser. So what does that mean is that what we're looking at here, this page is supposed to run that script. So in order to do that, I'm going to actually include this script. So I'm going to do that with a script tag. What you can do with a script tag is you can either write script directly in here, or declare a source, which in my case I will do, because I just simply want to look at the script.js at this point. Okay, so let's actually keep this as simple as possible, and basically maybe inspector element here. Okay, so as of now, as you can see, the script is completely empty. Nothing really happened. So the first thing that I want to do is to verify that my script has loaded correctly. Now what I can do, and I want to get you used to using your inspection. So I'm using Firefox, but it's pretty much the same in Chrome. There are differences in how things work, but you will find a network tab on both, and the same with Safari and so on. So this is at this level, it's pretty much the same across browsers. And you can see that my script.js is loaded here, right? This is in the network tab. I can see what kind of resources I'm loading. So here I'm loading a favicon, which is because that's what my IDE does. And then script style and index is that's the HTML I'm loading. So that's what I get. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to look at the console. So the console is something that would basically output whatever gets reported towards the console. So that could be errors, that could be warnings, that could be logs, and so on. So I can talk to this console in two ways, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say test, and I'm going to run this, and as you can see, it tells me test. Okay, so what have we done here? So as you can see, console seems to be available. I do not declare this, and this is maybe something that we want to start out with. So if I want to declare a variable in JavaScript, I have three options. It is const, let, or var. So in old code, you will find var test equals, and then we can declare a string, just like in PHP or most other languages. And then I'm ending it, just like in most languages, with a semicolon. Now I have declared the variable test. Now the reason this is underlined in my IDE is because this is a general variable, and it is not recommended to use this anymore. The reason for that is because we now want to use let or const, and var basically can lead to issues when it comes to inheritance and so on, and is but nonetheless you will find that in a lot of old code, because that used to be the only way to declare variables in JavaScript for the really long time. So let's start with const. Okay, so in JavaScript, you can basically declare things mutable and immutable. What does that mean? It basically means that even though it is a loosely typed language, so there's not really a reason to declare this as a string, as you can see, the interpreter, when it runs, does exactly that, just like in PHP. So an interpreted language would basically execute the code on the fly if you want so, right? It's a little bit more complicated, but to simplify it down. So if I define something as a const, or a constant, then basically what I'm doing is I kind of set this into stone for the runtime. Okay, so if I say console log this variable, then I still get, as you can see, the test. Now if I try to change that and say, okay, test equals something else. And by the way, just like in also most other string-based languages, I can use double quotes or single quotes depending on my needs. And in JavaScript, even let's not go into literals now. So as you can see, this is now underlined, right? I'm trying to redeclare test. So if I run this, I get a type error, invalid assignment to constant test. So I cannot override test on this level, because test is a constant and cannot be changed at runtime. So we call that immutable. So it's not it cannot change its value or type. Now if I change this to let, you will see everything runs fine, and now I get something else because I was able to successfully change the value. Do you see that concept? Now that is something pretty important to understand. And at the beginning, there are difficult concepts like what is, especially when you meet something like concepts like this, and how certain things are what's is referred to as scope, right? What's the scope you're currently executing something in? That we will get into later. At the beginning, in a very, very high level rule of thumb is to say, well, as soon as you can make something a constant, make it a constant. Okay, so that's maybe a little bit of a awkward kind of rule, but later on you will notice that makes somewhat sense, and enables you to write something without understanding particular concepts yet in full. So there's something to be said about depth, though. So let's just say, like, okay, I'm going to define this as a constant again, and instead of this being a string, I'm going to define this as an object. Now an object is defined with curly braces in JavaScript, and here I'm going to say test value or test key is test. So what I can do now is I can go through this object by dots. So now I have test, and test has the property key Looks just like a JSON if you've seen that before. And that property key has the value test. And maybe we do this a little bit differently and say Sam. So if I were to write test dot key, as you can see, it's already recommended, then I should be able to log Sam here. So let's reload that and see. And you can see it says Sam. See that? Now we have to find that as a constant, so that means we cannot change that, right? Well, that's not exactly true in this case. So if I wanted to change the value of Sam, I could now do so. So I can say test key equals Adam. And as you can see, that works like a charm. Right? Why does that work like a charm? Well, because it didn't change the constant. It still has the same structure. We're just giving it different values here. Right? So the interesting question is, could I do something like test another is Adam? And you can see I can do that as well. Another doesn't exist yet. Right? And if I say, okay, what if I ask for another? Will that work? And of course it does. Now, how does the object look now after I added another? So since I can just assign this, if I only log test, what's going to happen is that this is going to show me this is the object. Let me open this up. And the object has basically two properties. One is another, is Adam, and one is key, Sam. So just what we had. And I can, and I can basically keep that accordingly. Now, the reason to basically work with objects is because it's pretty easy to navigate through them, and I can have all kinds of different things in there. So, for example, instead of just a string, let's just say we do that, and here we're going to say. I'm not going to do a function yet. We're going to do object, and I'm just going to start another object in here where I'm going to say prop is value. Now, as you can see, this is now a deeper, we can look at it here. This is now a deeper object here that contains another object. So of course I can say, okay, so test.object.prop, and it should get value, which I do. Right? So this is a pretty easy way to do that. But again, at the end we do have a string as a value. And so we talked about strings, and what we still need to talk about is, okay, what are the different types of strings I can basically produce, and why is that? So what you see here, and we have talked about the single quotes. Now, just like in PHP, the single quotes basically break particular behavior, right? So if I were to say, okay, and you probably remember that we basically did something like, okay, Adam, and then we included some kind of value. If I were to do that here, so I now say, like, I would say Adam and I want to say whatever Sam, whatever the key is, right? And say, okay, test.key. I could not do that. It would basically just be a string, right? So test.key would now not be, this would not say Sam. As you can see, it was just a string. So instead of the dot that we use in PHP, we use the plus to amend. And if I do this, test.key, then you can see my, oops, also want to display that. Now it says Adam and Sam, so it's taking in the actual value of test.key, so test.key. See that? Now, there are different ways of doing this. So in JavaScript, there's something called a string literal. So if I'm using, let me get rid of this quickly. If I'm using the tilde character in order to define a string, what I can do is all of a sudden I have a particular markup that is now native to JavaScript, which is basically like a $sign and then curly braces, and then my expression. So in that case, it's test.key. See that? And the result is of course still the same. So now I can basically write inline, right, and just go on with my string after that. And that's something that you will see in React a lot, for example, because JSX is basically based on that principle. And that is also a pretty easy way of you know, substituting well, basically content with variable values. Now, what about this? Does this work? No, it doesn't. I mean, I can actually show it to you. See, it's not interpreted, and there's no way to inline interpret with anything else but a string literal. However, what is interesting to know is that the double quotes are basically interpreted in a way that would allow for conversion of based on the what's it called, encoding. So this is a new line character, for example. So if I place a new line character and then after that I say here should be on the next line. Let's see if that's the case. And you can see Adam and Sam, and then on the new line it says here, right? If I do that in single quotes, right, and run it, oh, it actually still works. On the console, it still seems to work. So never mind that. But some of the characters in that are basically particular to your encoding would basically have problems in the single quotes. Now the same counts for something that looks pretty much similar to a object, and that's a so-called JSON, which requires you to basically set things in double quotes. So I can actually show you that in a very simple manner and say, let's do let's convert it is, and don't worry this at the moment, but I'm going to parse test, and it doesn't want that. It wants to have, of course, have the other way around. My bad. And then we're going to show convert it. Okay, so as you can see, this is now a string that has all of a sudden key with quotes, right? Same for object and so on. Do you see that? Now, in order to basically, you should know that you can do that, right? So this will still work fine for us in our context, and sometimes you even need to do that. So what I cannot do, for example, is I cannot say something like some measure gold. As you can see, it's kind of freaking out here. That is because if I have a key like that, it will not work. So I need to formulate the key as a string, and then it will work like a charm. And that's basically when you need it. And what you can also do, and let's get rid of that again, is how do you get, and that's something that you will get to soon if you're basically writing real code. How do you get to a property that you have as a variable itself? So let's just say that we have excuse me, we have a property that is key. Okay, we're going to simplify this down now, so to keep it as simple as possible. So, and then we basically want to say, okay, how do we want to get a test depending on the variable property. Okay, so I cannot write test.prop, test.prop. That doesn't work. So what I can do is I can say, well, I'm going to find it by string. So I'm going to use the heart brackets and then put in prop, right? And then you will see that it just shows Sam, because this basically translates if you want to. So prop has the value key. So this is the same as writing test.key, which might not be logical to you at this point, but this is going to come up pretty quickly that you need a way to basically address that accordingly. Okay, so we've talked about variables, we've talked about objects. We should probably look into the differences of loops, but before we do so, let's jump into something that is a function. So how you declare a function in JavaScript is pretty simple. So let's say I create a function test. So this is what is called a named function, and you can see that this looks also pretty familiar with most other languages. So I have the function keyword, then a name. Here is a space for my properties, so what I pass into the function, and then here I basically define the if you want to, the borders of the function. So in between here is code executed with this function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to introduce another keyword that's going to be called alert, and I'm going to alert test. So what this is supposed to do is this will trigger a pop-up if the function test is called. So if I do this now, the function test will not be called, and the reason for that is, of course, well, I defined the function, but I'm not actually calling the function, right? So let's do the following and call this function. Okay, so now I basically execute it, and as you can see, I now get this message test, right? Which is what alert does, and that's basically one way of referring to it. So what you will see a lot, and this is basically the magic of JavaScript a little bit, is like that most functions are not named like this, but they're anonymous functions, right? So what I can also do is to basically say, okay, constant test equals. Right? So to be clear, we should have it in this case. So I told you that you can assign variables to any type, including functions, of course. So now, by the way, the functionality shouldn't change, so this still shows us test. But now test is a variable, and the function itself does not have a name, so it's called an anonymous function. Okay? And still does the same, of course. So now I can basically say, okay, this is, while it does the same, what I'm actually calling is the variable test, which will execute the function alert. And the reason why that is pretty cool is because, well, of course, as you remember, we can go deep in things. So if I say test object, I can basically place alert me. Actually, let's keep that clean for now. And write it like this as well. So now test doesn't exist, but this is still a property of the variable test object, which again is an object. So I can say, okay, so test object dot alert me, and you will see it's still doing the same. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the properties. So we already said, like, okay, you can place properties in here, arguments in here, that can then be referred to as such. So here I'm going to say text, and I don't have to do a let or var or whatever. This will be available. And here say, please alert whatever text is. Okay. So that means I can now pass in something. I mean, it should be a string, but we haven't declared that. So, but from the logic, into this alert me function, and it would alert it accordingly. So as you can see, we have not done that when we're actually calling it. So that means that text should be undefined, right? Let's see if that actually happens. Yes, it is. It's undefined. So let's just place show me this text. Let's place a string in here, and what will happen is it shows me this text. Okay? So that's basically how a function looks like. So we talked about like ECMAscript and you know, more modern approaches. So while constant let is part of that, you know, you have different ways of writing a function. So just to give you an example, let me do something like const call me equals, and then let's do it like this maybe. Oops. Oh, I doesn't do that. Okay. So what this does is, and actually let's not alert stuff here. Let's call me and see what happens. So as you can see, I have foo in the console, which, okay, that's not the big surprise, right? We've written that. But what this kind of markup, what this actually is okay, so this, we got rid of the function here. We don't need this anymore, right? This we don't need anymore. There's still room for arguments here, right? And then instead of the curly braces, we have this double arrow or fat arrow, and then we directly execute it. Okay, and you see it works like a charm. Now, as soon as this is basically if I'm calling something directly. So if you need multiple lines, you will still find that this is mostly written like this, where you basically say, okay, so now you can go on and have, you know, more complex functionality, but this still persists. And the argument, let's do again text and basically say, let's log that. And here I say, please log this text. You will see that we get that accordingly. Okay? So there's a huge difference in writing a function like this and writing a function like that. And that difference, oh, and sorry, just before I forget, and if you have only one argument, you might as well leave that away as well. Right? This still works fine. Still works fine. Now it's a problem. If I say there's a second argument, it will start to freak out. Then I need the parentheses. See, now it's okay. So just to show you the different kinds of writing. Now, there's a huge difference in those two functions, and that has that again is something that we're going to explore very, very deep in the next session when we talk about this context and what scope means and how inheritance works, and you know, how more complex systems would inherit. But for now, we don't need to do that. It's just something that you should keep in the back of your head, that you know, this makes a difference. This is not just a different way of writing, but you can also have particular behavior by choosing which way you would write a function. However, in most cases, this is even what you want, right? This you will find that a lot of code, you will not find one line that actually says function. Most of the functions are written like this in modern applications. But that's not, again, don't get that wrong. That does not mean that if you see a function written like that, you know, that's not modern and not new or whatever. That there's probably a reason for that. Now that said, let's look into why JavaScript, right? So in the browser, as you can imagine, the console is not really that interesting to us. What we actually want to do is manipulate the DOM, which is something that we have dabbled in a little bit in, let's just make something here. So I will basically create an ID. I'm going to call it test, whatever, and say content. Okay. So that's a little bit boring for us. It's just basically going to say content here. But what we're now going to do with JavaScript, and let me get rid of all of this, we don't need this anymore, is we are trying to access and manipulate this element. So if you go back to the inspector, and let's actually do this here, you will see that this diff ID is something that exists right now in this here below the one, and JavaScript basically directly hooks into the DOM, so the structure of the document. So that is why the document is the direct access to the DOM I'm run from. So don't forget that we have included this here in the body. So we could have done that in head, but that has something to do with when something is loaded. So I would recommend in 99% of the cases to place it here at the end of the body. And so now we can, because then we know that the document already has been loaded. So I have something like get element by ID on the document. And let's do that and say, okay, I want to grab test. And I also want to assign that to the variable test. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to log how JavaScript looks at this. Okay, so you will not notice any kind of difference here, but if I look at the console, you will see that, oh, I have this element all of a sudden now. Okay, and oh, this seems to be a very, very complex way of interaction that I can do. So those are all properties I can use, right? They're native JavaScript implementations of how particular elements are seen, in that case a div container. So you can see that there are children and all kinds of things, and you can basically also see what this is, right? Offset to top, this would be, so there's styling included, there's certain functionality. You see that in the prototypes. There's so much stuff that you can access there, and that's basically something that you can dabble into yourself. You will find that a lot of things are deep, a lot of things are functions, some are just, most of the things I can basically directly access and overwrite, which is exactly what we're going to do now. So I want to change the inner HTML. So let's see if we find that and how that is even sorted. Oh, this is this. Yeah. Do you see inner HTML says content, right? Same with inner text. That has something to do with how nodes are interpreted. So there could be, this could be deeper, right? I mean, now we only have this direct level. There's not even a space and nothing in there, but this could be a deeper level, and the inner HTML might differ from the inner text. So the inner HTML though is basically the complete content that I want to access, and I'm going to reassign it. So what I'm going to do instead now is I'm going to say, okay, test.innerHTML, and I'm going to override it with this is JavaScript content. And the result of that is that I will now see something that is not in the HTML. I've overwritten the content of this DOM. So in the if I inspect it, I will see it, right? This is what's happening now. But here I will not. This is of course still my original file, and nobody has the power to touch that. So I can all of a sudden have dynamic content that is interpreted by the browser just by using JavaScript. Now, there's a lot of things that I can do. Let's maybe do something else. Let's jump through. So we have content. Let's go to styling maybe quickly. Just a couple of examples. Again, you should basically you can explore that yourself if you want to. But what I want to do now is I want to say style color, and I want to have that red. And if I reload it, then you will see it's now red as well. Okay, so there are a lot of things that we can do in this respect. So what do we do? Content, styling. We can basically change well, that would still be styling actually. But let's just do also something else and say test display. So as you, oh sorry, style. style display. And you will notice that a lot of this is basically CSS, what I'm doing right now, right? So now it's basically not displayed anymore. And a lot of it will have something to do with what I want to achieve when I build an application, okay? So let's build something super stupid now, and let's place a button here, okay? And I say, show me. And I'm gonna start with an onClick and say, show. Actually, just show. No, let's do it clean, okay? Now I'm going to write a function here that's going to call show. And so what that's going to do is it's going to say test what is it? Style dot display and we're going to say block. Okay, so what happened now? So we don't see the content right now, right? So what happened? We got the content by ID. We changed the content itself. We changed the color to red, and then we started to hide it. And now we have a button that has an onClick, which is a particular event, that executes the function show. So we have this function show. So what we want to happen now is that this element now shows because we changed the display from none to block. Let's see if that works. And as you can see, you have your first little application here. And so that's basically you know what from there everything else derives, right? So that enables you to basically build very, very complex things, and this is very nonsensical what we're doing here, but I just wanted to show you basically what the general idea was back in the days and what we made out of it. Now going back to modern JavaScript, so this is an implementation that's been around for a while, and what you can do nowadays is, and it's actually going to bitch a little bit, so I'm going to define that as a comment, is I can use a querySelector. And what that is there are two implementations, so querySelector all and querySelector. querySelector would basically give me the first element that I find. And what I can then do is, just like CSS rules, I basically say, okay, so I'm searching for an ID, so that's indicated by hashtag. And I remember that the ID that I gave it was test, right? Do you see this? Test. Right, and that allows me to use different selectors. So let's just assume that, or let's, first run this, so you will see this will not change anything in this respect, even though again there are differences in what I get back here, but let's ignore that for now. So I can have you know, pretty complex selector strings here, just like in CSS, that would basically define what I'm specifically looking for. So if I were to say, okay, this is a class rather than an ID, then you know I can basically say, okay, then it's a dot instead, right? And you can see it still doesn't change anything. And you will find that also a lot. And the querySelector all will of course return every element that has this particular class right now. This will not work with ID, by the way, because an ID should be unique. Okay, so far so good. And then the last thing, not to get too far, that I want to talk about is events on a very high level. So we now have this onClick here, right? Do you see that? So what we can also do in JavaScript is, and that's important if you have no control over the DOM. So let's just say that instead of any kind of functionality here, the only thing we know about this button is that it is the show me button. Okay, has the class show me. That's the only thing we know, or has the ID show me. Oops. Let's even call this show me button. Okay, so how do we target anything that happens with this button? Okay, well, that is something that we should basically try to figure out. So we have the possibility to say, okay, my button is, and let's just do the same, right? And say, okay, this is document.querySelector, and we know that it is the show me button. Oops. Okay. And what I can do now is I can influence the events that this button has, just like I can influence the HTML and the style and so on. I can of course influence basically what happens when particular things are fired. So you probably noticed that you know, like there are some things that you know from styling, you know, visited and active and those things that are set by the browser. Those are all events at the end of the day. So I basically want to have a button add event listener, and I want to listen to a particular event, and that event is called click. And then I'm just executing my function, right? So the second argument of this add event listener, so here's the type, and then here's the listener, right? And this would basically now be where I write my show functionality. But since I've already defined show, I can simply refer to it and say, well, in that case, show, right? Add event listener click, and then execute the function show. So let me see if that still works. Well, it actually doesn't. Let me see why. Button is null. Okay, so that doesn't work. Show me button. Show me button. Oh, it's not a class. It's not a class, so we can't find that. There we go. And so what we're doing now is basically we say, like, okay, this event has a, you know, uses a particular function that is fired if the click event happens. Now, those events are the moment JavaScript can hook into those events is before native implementation happens. That's very powerful. So let's just assume that this is in reality a link. So it has an href to somewhere else, right? To I don't know, a 404.html. Okay. So what happens now is if I click this, it will actually redirect me to a page that doesn't exist. See that? So that's actually a pity. But since I can capture the event before anything else happens, what I can do is in my show function, I can basically say, so let's just say that we're capturing the event, and this happens automatically, right? This the event is actually, let's look at that quickly. So the first thing that I want to do though on the event is I want to prevent the default behavior. So I don't want you to move away, right? So the default behavior of an A tag with an href is of course to execute a link, right? So to move somewhere else. So as you can see, if I execute it now, it will not happen. It will simply not happen anymore. So I just prevented that from happening. And the next thing I want to show you here is if I log the event, you will see that the event itself is a mystery you can explore. So here the event was click. That's the event we listened for, so that makes sense. And you can basically have all kinds of information based on, you know, where the mouse was, where it was clicked, what's the source element of the event. And you can go really, what's the target of the event? You can go really into detail of finding out basically where particular actions, what they were intended to do and where they come from, and react on that accordingly, which is sometimes very interesting if you want to know, well, you know, what was clicked without being able to know that. If you have multiple buttons, for example, and you want to know which button was clicked, you can use the event to figure that out. And that basically, I think, is about what we need to explore today. that will help you if you find, like other online tutorials, or if you're looking into code and so on. I hope this will help you to kind of explore how, this basically comes together, right? Where you say like, okay, now I have somewhat of an understanding of why things are written that way, and I hope it enables you to jump in to a certain extent and be able to read your first code, and maybe even play around and write your first code. So have fun. I know it's a lot to learn. It's we haven't even touched we're not even done talking about the basics, but maybe it already helps you to kind of have the first click in your head that helps you to start the process. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe to follow the rest of this playlist. I noticed that a lot of people come in and they watch like a video of the playlist and then don't really find the related videos. So make sure you work yourself through from A to C if you want so, and follow the logical order of how I explain things, because that's the only way it really makes sense. You of course are welcome to come in and jump in on any topic you feel you're missing something, but the whole concept is that I will explain things in a way that will enable you to jump into development, and it makes sense to basically listen to explanations of certain concepts that I've done, maybe on a different high-level topic, right? Because again, what an iteration is something that we talked about in PHP, and we will simply apply that in JavaScript. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go in an in-depth explanation again. Thank you so much for watching, and again, see you soon.